Hi everyone! Today we will see how to make a very basic suicide burn script that you could use on a booster or a moonlander. This tutorial is made for Vizzy in Simple Rockets 2, but you could use this in KSP or any other physics simulation game. Here's the code. As you can see, it's very simple, so let's get started. At first, I didn't want to get into suicide burn scripts, because I thought it was going to be way too difficult. But it's actually possible to make one with just some basic high school physics. In this first part, we'll talk about the math. If you don't care about it, just skip to the second part, where we will talk about the script. We will use three basic motion equations. The first one, which gives our position x depending on t, the second one, which gives our velocity v depending on t, and the third one, which gives our velocity squared depending on t. This last one is particularly useful because you don't need to know t to calculate the rest. In this video, a will be the acceleration, t the time, v our velocity, and x our position. To understand these equations, we're going to consider a moving object. This object is going to have an initial position and a final position. It's also going to have an initial velocity and a final velocity. During this motion, we're going to consider the acceleration constant, and t will be the time between the initial position and the final position. We're talking about a falling rocket, so we're not going to use the x-axis, but the z-axis. Our initial z position will be the altitude AGL. Our final z position will be the ground level. Our initial velocity will be the velocity vertical. Our final velocity will be equal to 0, because we want to land. We're also going to use the gravity g, which we can calculate with the game block velocity gravity, and we're going to use the length block to get the value of this vector. The first thing we'll want to calculate is the altitude d at which we want to start our landing burn. We can calculate it with this equation. D equals our initial velocity times t divided by 2. T is the time that our landing burn will take. We don't know this time, so we have to calculate it as well. We can calculate it with this equation. T equals our initial velocity divided by our maximum acceleration minus the gravity. We can now combine these two equations into one. This is our final equation for D. Now what we want to calculate is the acceleration that we want during this burn. We can do this with this equation. The targeted acceleration will be our initial velocity squared divided by 2 initial position. We cannot directly input this acceleration in our rocket. We have to convert it to a throttle value. We can do this very easily with this equation. Now we just need to calculate our maximum acceleration. This is also very easy. The maximum acceleration of the craft equals the maximum thrust of the craft divided by the mass minus the gravity. We already have everything we need for this suicide burn. It's as easy as that. Let's sum everything up. When our rocket is going to fall, we'll want to calculate the altitude d at which we want to start burning. Then we want to calculate the acceleration needed, extend the landing gears, and land. Now we'll take a look at the actual script. Here's the code. I've broken it down into different parts that we can check one by one. We're going to start with the custom expressions. Custom expressions are very useful because they're going to simplify our equations. We've already seen g in the previous part. Altitude returns the altitude AGL minus AGL offset. We'll see what that is later on. Falling returns true if the rocket is falling, false if the rocket is not falling. We can find out if the rocket is falling by checking if the vertical velocity is inferior or greater than 0. These are the 4 equations we saw in the first part, so I'm not going to go through them again, but you can pause the video to check them. These custom expressions give me these blocks that I can use everywhere in the code. They're making the code smaller and simpler by putting all the repeated equations into one small block. Now let's check the actual code. At first, we're going to set a few variables. The altitude HGL block gives the altitude of the center of the craft, but we want to land when the bottom of the craft is at 0, not when the center of the craft is at 0. So in a way, we're calibrating the altitude. We're setting AGL offset to the altitude AGL of the rocket on the launch pad. For example, if on the launch pad your rocket has an AGL of 10 meters, that means that the center of the rocket is 10 meters higher off the ground, and you want to land when your altitude is at 10 meters and not 0. We're also adding a landing offset. This is just to have a margin of precision. Just after that, we're locking the heading and waiting 3 seconds so that the rocket doesn't launch right after the game started. Then we're going to launch the rocket and wait until the apoapsis is 3000 meters high. When that happens, we're going to turn off the engine and wait until the rocket is falling. And we're going to lock the heading on retrograde. Then we're going to start the landing burn. As long as the rocket is falling or that it's not grounded, we're going to do our calculations. First, we're going to display some information. I'm going to come back on the format block later on. If our altitude is inferior to D, we're going to start burning. D is the altitude at which we want to start our landing burn. If our altitude is inferior to our landing offset, we're going to turn off our engines, break the loop to come out, and display landed. And it's finished already. So I'm going to combine all of these together, and we're going to test that. When we launch the rocket, it's going to wait 3 seconds and launch. Then it's going to wait for the apoapsis to be 3 kilometers high. At this moment, it's going to turn off the engines and wait for the rocket to fall. When the rocket starts falling, we can see that it's displaying information. You can look at D, which is the altitude at which it will start burning. When it starts burning, it's going to keep up at the targeted acceleration. You can see the throttle changing. And it landed. But as you can see, the landing gear didn't extend. We're going to correct that right away. For the landing gear to extend, we're going to add a custom expression. This one. This custom expression will return the distance d traveled during the time t. This is the x of t equation we saw at the beginning of the video. I know my landing gears take approximately 10 seconds to extend, so I'm going to calculate the distance traveled during 10 seconds. If our craft goes under this distance, we're going to activate the landing gears. Let's test that. As you can see, they extended at the perfect timing. This script is one of the simplest you can have, and there's a lot that can be improved, especially if your rocket is coming back from orbital velocity, for example. In the third part of this video, I will show you an improved version of this script. Here's how the craft looks in flight. We're going to do as if we wanted to go to orbit and raise our apoapsis to at least 100 kilometers. When that's done, I can activate the program and it will start by calculating the AGL offset. I'll explain how it works when we check the code. It will then go to retrograde and wait for the apoapsis. The next step will be to perform an entry burn, to kill all the lateral velocity and to prevent burning when entering the atmosphere. When that's done, we can go back to retrograde and wait for the landing burn. And we landed. A bit roughly, but we landed. Now let's see the code. Here it is. I won't be going through everything because it would be a bit too long and it's not that difficult. The first thing it does when you activate the program is that it gets the AGL offset. As you can see, it's a custom instruction that's linked to this code. The AGL offset is the difference between the lowest part's position and the center of the craft's position. To calculate it, we put the rocket straight up and we loop through each part to find which one is the lowest one. In this loop, I will start at the minimum part ID and will finish at the maximum part ID, each time increasing by 1. This way we're going to loop through each part in the craft. We're going to take the part I position, convert it to a latitude-longitude AGL vector, and take the z of this vector, which is the AGL. If this altitude is greater than 0, that means that the part exists and we want to execute this line. Otherwise, we're just going to go on. If the part exists, we want to set AGL offset to the minimum value of the old AGL offset and the new AGL offset calculated here by doing the difference between the part's position and the craft's position. When we'll have finished looping through all the parts, we're going to set the AGL offset to the absolute value of AGL offset and add a little margin. After that, if the rocket is in orbit, we're going to perform a deorbit burn and then just land. Before we get into the landing script, I'm going to talk a bit about the format block. The format block will replace each value in between brackets with the corresponding block on the right. Here the 0 corresponds to the time since launch, and the 1 to the display text. The second 0 here means that I don't want any digit after the dot. Here, for example, I want 2 digits after the dot. Now let's really go into the landing script. While we're not falling, we're going to display the time to apoapsis. While our altitude is greater than the altitude at which we want to start burning. If our altitude is under 70,000 meters, then we're going to display the time until landing burn. Otherwise, we're going to display waiting for entry burn. If we get under 70,000 meters and our eccentricity is low, which means we have a lot of lateral velocity, we're going to perform an entry burn. When we get under this altitude D, we're going to go to the second part of the code. This part looks a lot like the first program, with a few exceptions. We're going to execute our landing burn as long as our vertical velocity is under -2. The second difference is here. We're going to divide the throttle by the sine of the craft's pitch. This is because when we're going to land, we'll still have some lateral velocity, and our craft will pitch a bit to compensate, and thus our thrust won't be as efficient. The last thing that's different is this custom expression. You can get it by reversing and combining 2 of the equations we saw at the beginning of the video. It gives the time t that the craft will take to travel the distance d. It's used here, for example, to get the time until landing burn. And that's it for today. I hope I wasn't too quick on this last part, and that you enjoyed the video. If you still have some questions, feel free to ask them in the comments. And I'll see you in the next one.